Imagine this. You're a commander on a distant alien world, expecting an entire human fleet to arrive. Reports told you that humanity would send an armada, a force so overwhelming that it would be impossible to resist. Thousands of warships, orbital bombardments, entire divisions of battle-hardened marines descending from the skies. That was how wars were fought in the galactic theater. Overwhelming numbers, brute force, massive coordinated invasions. It was the way every empire had fought for millennia. And yet, as you stand in the control room of your command station, watching the void beyond, you see nothing. No fleet, no swarms of gunships, just silence. Then, a single blip on the sensors. One ship, one lone human warship dropping out of hyperspace, its silhouette unlike anything you've seen before. At first, there's laughter, murmurs of disbelief. How could humanity possibly expect to win with a single vessel? Then, the battle begins, and in the span of mere minutes, the laughter turns into horrified silence. Because that one warship, just one, was unlike anything the galaxy had ever encountered before. This is the story of the battle that rewrote military strategy. The moment when the galaxy learned that underestimating humanity was the worst mistake they could ever make. For centuries, the Ulnari Dominion had ruled this sector of the galaxy with an iron grip. Their fleet was a monolithic powerhouse, 40,000 warships strong, spread across countless star systems, enforcing their dominion through sheer brutal force. They crushed rebellions, dominated trade routes, and absorbed weaker civilizations into their empire without effort. Their doctrine was simple. War is won through numbers and firepower. Any opponent who stood against them was simply outgunned, outnumbered, and annihilated. And yet, in their arrogance, they made a fatal miscalculation. When humanity, a relatively new species in the grand interstellar theater, resisted an Ulnari invasion, the Dominion expected them to surrender immediately or be crushed beneath superior force. After all, that was how every other species had responded. Even the mighty Karza war clans, who had once terrorized the outer systems, had bent the knee after facing the full might of the Dominion's fleet. Why would humanity be any different? The target of this engagement was Caldris Prime, a thriving, human colony rich in minerals, strategically positioned along a major trade route. It was one of the most valuable assets in human space, a jewel of economic prosperity, and a key military outpost. The Ulnari assumed that humanity would deploy a massive fleet to defend it. That was the logical approach: overwhelming numbers, a show of force. The Dominion had already sent a battle group of 70 warships to blockade the system and await reinforcements for a full-scale planetary assault. Victory was assumed. Instead, humanity sent one warship. Just one. A single vessel, emerging from the abyss of hyperspace, alone against an armada. To the Ulnari, it was an insult, an act of foolish defiance. Some even believed it was a diplomatic envoy sent to negotiate terms of surrender. But they were wrong. Very, very wrong. Because the ship humanity had sent was the TNS Revenant. A prototype unlike anything seen before, the Revenant was not designed for traditional warfare. It was not built to trade broadside fire with enemy battleships, nor was it meant to overwhelm defenses through sheer firepower. Instead, it was a vessel that embodied a new form of war, one that the Ulnari had never prepared for: asymmetric warfare. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Right now, HFY Chronicles-849 is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of the universe, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us grow this community together. The Revenant was a ghost in the battlefield, a predator designed to strike fast and disappear before the enemy could react. It was smaller than an Ulnari battleship but twice as deadly. Equipped with cutting-edge kinetic shielding, an exotic, radiation-absorbing hull, and an experimental hypervelocity railgun, it was built to redefine warfare itself. From the moment the Revenant entered the Caldris system, the Ulnari fleet barely registered it as a threat. Just one ship? Against an entire battle group? The Ulnari commander scoffed. His forces had 70 warships, including heavy cruisers and dreadnought-class battleships. The battle should have been over in minutes. But as the Revenant accelerated, the first warning signs appeared. The Ulnari sensors struggled to get a lock. The ship's profile was unusually small for a dreadnought, its hull coated in a nanophotonic camouflage layer that reduced its signature on active scans. It wasn't just hard to see, it was almost invisible to traditional tracking systems. Then came the first disruptions. Communications between Ulnari warships began glitching. Faint distortions at first, then full signal jamming. Their targeting systems scrambled. The Revenant's electronic warfare suite was unlike anything they had encountered before, weaving through their defenses like a predatory AI, corrupting data, feeding false signals, turning their own sensors against them. Then, the first strike. A single hypervelocity railgun round, traveling at nearly 25,000 miles per hour, tore through the lead Ulnari battleship. One shot, one kill. The projectile punched through the ship's hull like it was made of paper, detonating deep within the reactor core. The ship erupted into a fireball, splitting apart from the inside, its wreckage scattering into the void. Panic rippled through the fleet. This wasn't normal warfare. This was precision destruction. The Revenant didn't fight like an ordinary warship. It didn't line up for broadside engagements, didn't rely on missile volleys or slow, predictable energy weapons. It struck like a ghost, appearing, firing, and vanishing before the enemy could react. By the time the Ulnari realized what they were dealing with, it was already too late. The battle was no longer about numbers, it was about survival. Panic gripped the Ulnari fleet. Their battle group commander, Admiral Zelvaran, had never encountered anything like this before. Wars were supposed to be straightforward. One fleet against another, sheer numbers dictating the outcome. That was how the Ulnari had crushed every enemy before. But now, his tactical displays were flickering with distortions, his ships were failing to coordinate, and his men, seasoned warriors of the Dominion, were staring at the monitors in stunned horror. One ship. One. And yet, it was ripping them apart. Zelvaran snarled, mandibles clicking in frustration. "Target that vessel! All ships! Full barrage!" His fleet had 70 warships, and yet every single one was struggling to locate and lock onto a single human warship. His command ship, a massive dreadnought-class battle carrier, was the most advanced vessel in the Ulnari Armada. It boasted multi-layered plasma shielding, reactive armor plating, and a broad-spectrum targeting array that should have made it impossible to lose track of an enemy ship. But the TNS Revenant wasn't just an enemy ship. It was an executioner in the void. The Ulnari fleet fired in all directions, desperate to land a hit. Torpedoes and plasma cannons flared, filling the darkness with blinding light. But the Revenant was too fast, its propulsion systems pushing beyond anything conventional sensors could track. It weaved between incoming fire, shifting in erratic, unpredictable bursts. One moment here, the next moment gone. The Ulnari realized too late. This wasn't a warship in the traditional sense. This was a weaponized ghost. A machine of war that didn't fight by their rules. Then came the second strike. A burst of electronic interference washed over the fleet, causing shipboard AI systems to glitch and misfire. Navigation controls froze, weapon targeting systems scrambled, and tactical displays looped phantom sensor readings, making it impossible to distinguish friend from foe. And in the midst of the chaos, the Revenant struck again. A second hypervelocity railgun round punched through another Ulnari battleship, this time from below. The round hit with such force that the ship was split in half, its lower decks reduced to glowing slag. Explosions rippled outward, secondary blasts consuming nearby support craft. Then, a new horror. The Revenant had deployed drones. Not the slow, predictable combat drones that most fleets used, but adaptive hunter-killers, autonomous war machines, that thought for themselves, adjusting in real time to exploit weaknesses. They slipped through the debris field, weaving between the burning wrecks, each one a miniature executioner. "They're inside the formation!" one of Zelvaran's officers cried out, his voice high with alarm. The drones had bypassed the traditional front lines and were now inside the Ulnari fleet itself. These machines weren't just weapons, they were strategists. They identified exposed fuel lines, overloaded power relays, and critical structural weak points, striking with surgical precision. One by one, Ulnari ships began to fail. Not from massive firepower, but from the sheer, terrifying efficiency of human warfare. Zelvaran watched in disbelief as his dreadnought-class battle carrier shook violently. The internal shielding flickered, alarms blaring as his bridge crew scrambled to make sense of the battlefield. He turned his gaze toward the forward viewport, and finally saw the Revenant up close. It was beautiful and horrifying. The ship was sleek, matte black, its hull covered in adaptive plating that absorbed incoming fire and rerouted energy along hidden conduits. It didn't move like a warship. It moved like a predator, stalking through the void with calculated lethality. And then, it spoke. A transmission cut through the failing Ulnari systems. The voice was cold, human, and utterly devoid of fear. You wanted an army. You got me instead. Before Zelvaran could respond, the third and final strike of this engagement landed. Kinetic Lance, a weapon so advanced that most of the galaxy didn't even know it existed yet, fired from the Revenant's underbelly. It wasn't plasma. It wasn't a missile. It was a hyper-dense metallic spear, traveling at fractional light speed, tearing through 3 ships in a single, uninterrupted shot. The impact alone warped space-time for a fraction of a second, creating a shockwave that sent debris flying across the battlefield. The Ulnari fleet was shattered. Less than 5 minutes had passed since the battle had begun, and yet, already, over half the Ulnari warships were destroyed, their remains scattered across the void. The survivors had only 2 choices: stay and die, or flee and live with the shame of defeat. Zelvaran's mandibles tightened as he stared at the carnage. His people had never lost like this before, not once. And now, the impossible had happened. A single human warship had annihilated an entire battle group. And it was still there, unscathed, watching, waiting. It had made its point. Zelvaran's hands trembled as he finally gave the order no Ulnari had ever spoken before. All ships, retreat. But for humanity, this was only the beginning. Admiral Zelvaran had never known fear. He had crushed enemy fleets, executed planetary bombardments, and forced entire civilizations into submission. The Ulnari Dominion had stood undefeated for over 3 centuries, its military doctrine built on overwhelming numbers and brute force. The enemy was to be encircled, outgunned, and obliterated, never given a chance to fight back. Yet now, in the shattered remains of what was once a 70-ship armada, Zelvaran felt it. Not just fear, pure, unfiltered terror. His dreadnought's tactical screens flickered with erratic readings, showing sensor ghosts of 100 revenants where there was only one. The ship's AI was failing, struggling to process what it was seeing. His crew, trained, disciplined, and hardened by war, stared at their monitors with wide, unblinking eyes. No one had ever beaten the Ulnari like this. No one had ever made them run. The Revenant was not pursuing. That was the most unsettling part. It could have hunted them down, finished them off one by one, but it didn't. It simply hovered in the void, its matte black hull absorbing what little light remained from the wreckage of Ulnari ships. It was watching. Zelvaran's throat tightened. The psychological warfare was worse than the battle itself. The Ulnari had always been the ones to break an enemy's spirit, to leave them broken before the final strike. And yet, here they were. They were the ones who had been shattered. "Commander!" one of his officers shouted, pulling Zelvaran from his stunned silence. "We're receiving something." The audio transmission wasn't a voice. It wasn't even a language. It was a sound, a low, vibrating frequency. It wasn't random. It had structure. It shifted, resonated, and pulsed in specific patterns. Zelvaran's eyes narrowed. The Ulnari were no strangers to psychological warfare, but this was something new. "Analyze it," he ordered. His science officer ran the signal through multiple decryption matrices. "Sir, it's not a message in the conventional sense. It's—" He paused, visibly unsettled. "It's a battlefield report, an encoded summary of the battle." Zelvaran's blood turned to ice. "What?" The officer swallowed. "Sir, it's a record of everything that just happened. Every attack, every ship destroyed, every maneuver we attempted." And his mandibles clenched. "It's being transmitted into open space, as if—" Zelvaran knew exactly what this meant. The Revenant wasn't just watching. It was broadcasting. Not to the Ulnari, but to the rest of the galaxy. The battle was being turned into a warning, a lesson for anyone who might dare challenge humanity, and worse still, the Revenant wanted them to know. Zelvaran's claws dug into his armrest as realization hit him like a shockwave. The Ulnari were not just defeated, they were being made an example of. Across the bridge, officers whispered amongst themselves, their voices hushed and strained. The weight of humiliation was suffocating. They had gone into battle expecting a war. What they had encountered instead was a force they did not understand. And then, another horror. "Sir!" One of the communications officers gasped. "New readings. There's something happening in the debris field." Zelvaran's eyes snapped back to the viewport. At first, he saw nothing, just the wreckage of his once proud fleet drifting lifelessly in the abyss. Then, movement. At first it was subtle, a metallic glimmer amongst the darkness, then another, and another. Something was collecting the wreckage. The science officer paled. "Sir, I think the Revenant is salvaging our ships." Zelvaran's blood ran cold. The Ulnari had always assumed that human warships were built like theirs, mass-produced, functional, but ultimately replaceable. But now, it was clear. The Revenant wasn't just a ship. It was a growing, evolving entity. It wasn't merely destroying the Ulnari fleet. It was absorbing it. The horror spread across the bridge like wildfire. The whispers turned to murmurs. The murmurs became fearful prayers, and then another transmission. This time, a voice. It was calm, measured, and absolute. "You are free to leave." Zelvaran's claws clenched into fists. What kind of mockery was this? His fleet had been annihilated. His men had been humiliated in front of the entire galaxy. And now, the humans were granting them mercy? No, not mercy. Control. The Revenant was in control of this battlefield, and it had made a decision. The Ulnari were no longer worth its time. For a species that had prided itself on never surrendering, the reality was crushing. They had not been defeated in battle. They had been dismissed. Zelvaran had no choice. He gritted his mandibles, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. All ships, set course for Ulnari Prime. Now. There was no resistance, no argument. His officers obeyed immediately, their silence more telling than words ever could be. As the battered remnants of the once mighty Ulnari fleet limped away into the void, the Revenant remained where it was, unmoving, unstoppable, untouched. The Ulnari Dominion had expected a war against an entire human fleet. Instead, they had faced one warship, and lost everything. But as Zelvaran's ship made its jump into hyperspace, he knew, deep in his bones, that this was not the end. No, this was only the beginning. As the battered remnants of the Ulnari fleet tore through space, their hyperdrives barely holding together, Admiral Zelvaran sat in agonizing silence. The bridge was eerily quiet. No arguments, no status reports, not even the usual hum of crew chatter. Just a room full of warriors who had lost their faith. The Ulnari Dominion had suffered losses before. Fleets destroyed, planets contested, but never humiliation. Never had they been forced to retreat, their spirits broken not by firepower, but by the cold, calculated will of a single human warship. A warship that had not pursued them. A warship that had not finished them off. A warship that had simply let them go. That fact, more than anything, gnawed at Zelvaran's soul. This wasn't how war was fought. The Ulnari knew war. They had perfected it over 300 years of conquest. They crushed their enemies, overwhelmed them with fleets so massive that resistance was pointless. There were rules, patterns, expectations. The humans had shattered all of them. "Sir," the voice broke through the silence like a crack of thunder. Zelvaran turned his gaze to his communications officer, who looked visibly shaken. "Speak." The officer hesitated, mandibles twitching. "We're receiving transmissions, Admiral. Not from the humans. From across the Dominion." Zelvaran's expression darkened. "Patch it through." The main display flickered, revealing a horrifying reality. News of the battle had spread. Every major Ulnari world, every military outpost, every colony, every strategic command center was receiving the broadcast from the Revenant. Every detail of their humiliating defeat was being relayed in real time. The footage showed the Ulnari fleet breaking formation, their ships crippling under unseen strikes, their mighty dreadnoughts falling apart like cheap metal, their officers panicking as their strategies failed. There were no dramatic last stands, no heroic sacrifices, no glorious battle worthy of song. There was only one warship, standing alone, dictating the fate of an empire, and the galaxy was watching. Zelvaran's fists tightened until his claws pierced his own skin. "Shut it off," he growled. "Sir." The officer swallowed. "It's on every frequency, every Dominion relay, even our private military networks." Zelvaran's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a battle report. This was a calculated act of psychological warfare. The Revenant hadn't just defeated them. It was erasing their credibility. No one would fear the Ulnari anymore. No one would respect their armadas. No one would bow before them. Zelvaran turned, his mandibles clenched so tightly they ached. "How did they gain access to our networks?" The officer's response was barely a whisper. "Sir, the Revenant is still transmitting." Silence. The entire bridge crew froze. Zelvaran felt something crawl down his spine. The Revenant had access to their encrypted systems? That was impossible. Ulnari communications were triple-layer encrypted, using quantum entanglement keys that even their own engineers struggled to break. There was no way a single warship, no matter how advanced, could infiltrate their networks. And yet, "Sir," another officer spoke up, voice trembling. "There's something else." Zelvaran turned, his patience razor-thin. "What?" The officer hesitated, then transferred a single image to the main display. It was a single symbol. A human sigil. Stark, white emblem on a black backdrop. It was not an empire's flag, not a planetary sigil. It was a warning. A single word accompanied it, translated into flawless Ulnari script. Zelvaran read it aloud, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Vigilant." No. One spoke. No one breathed. It was a name. Not a warship, not a fleet. A single name. And yet, it carried more weight than an entire Ulnari armada. The Revenant was not just a ship. It was a legend in the making. And now, it had a name. The bridge remained deathly silent. Zelvaran could feel his own heart pounding. This was new. The Ulnari had encountered powerful warships before. They had battled galactic superpowers, rogue AI fleets, and even energy-based life forms that consumed entire systems. But never this. The humans had deployed one vessel, a ship that had won through strategy, manipulation, and sheer technological dominance. And now, it was branding itself. The Ulnari never gave their ships individual names. Their warships were numbered, replaceable, expendable. Humans? They named their weapons. They turned them into legends, and this one warship had single-handedly rewritten the rules of war. "Sir!" another officer gasped. "We have incoming messages from everyone." Zelvaran's mandibles twitched. "Who?" "Every major power in the sector. The Varasi clans, the Tervok coalition, the Rylan ascendancy, even the damn Scolari war brood." The officer's voice cracked. "They all want to know one thing." Zelvaran's breath was shallow. He already knew what they were asking. It was the same question burning in his mind. How did one human warship do this? The Ulnari had always been the dominant force, the ones who decided how battles were fought, but the Vigilant had rewritten the rules. It had proven something far worse than the humans being a growing power. It had proven that they didn't need a fleet to win. That one was enough. The Ulnari were not just defeated, they were obsolete. Zelvaran exhaled, staring at the single word on the display. Vigilant. The name would spread. It would become a legend, a whispered nightmare in Ulnari war councils, a cautionary tale in every fleet academy. And worst of all, this was only the first encounter. The Ulnari Dominion had once thought the humans were just another upstart race. Now they knew the truth. They were something else entirely, and the worst part? This war had only just begun. Admiral Zelvaran had spent his life waging war. He had commanded fleets that crushed entire planetary defenses in a matter of hours. He had orchestrated campaigns so swift and decisive that enemy civilizations surrendered before the first battle was even fought. But this was something else. He stared at the blinking icon on his personal terminal. The encrypted high-priority summons from the Ulnari High Council. This was not a request. This was a demand. Zelvaran took a slow breath before pressing the command to accept. The screen went dark for a moment, then flickered back to life, revealing the council chamber on the Ulnari homeworld. Seated around an enormous, crescent-shaped table were 12 of the most powerful beings in the Dominion. Each one was a veteran of conquest, their carapaces adorned with the ceremonial markings of their station. Behind them, a massive holographic projection displayed the devastating battle report. Zelvaran had seen this before, but never like this. Every detail had been dissected, every maneuver analyzed, every decision scrutinized, and now he would answer for it. The Supreme Chancellor, a towering figure whose body bore the scars of 100 campaigns, leaned forward. His voice was low, heavy with barely restrained anger. "Explain yourself, Admiral." Zelvaran held his ground. The battle was a trap. We were misled into believing the humans required an entire fleet to counter us. Instead, they fielded a single warship, one that exceeded every technological and tactical parameter we had on their species. The Chancellor's mandibles clicked in irritation. One ship, and yet you lost a fleet. The accusation was blunt, unforgiving. Zelvaran knew there was no excuse. There was no redemption for this loss. The Dominion had always ruled through sheer overwhelming force, and this battle had exposed that for the weakness it truly was. But it was more than just a loss of ships. This defeat had rippled across the entire Dominion. The military had become fractured. The ruling elite had become divided. There were whispers, dangerous ones. Many were questioning the entire philosophy of Ulnari warfare, and worse, some were beginning to question if the Ulnari were still the superior force in the galaxy. Zelvaran met the Chancellor's gaze. The warship in question, the Revenant, was not merely advanced. It was something else entirely. I believe it represents a new class of human warfare, one we have not accounted for. One of the other council members, a sharp-eyed strategist, known for her brutal efficiency, narrowed her gaze. "Then tell us, Admiral, what exactly did we face?" Zelvaran exhaled, knowing the truth would shake them to their core. "It wasn't a ship," he said. "It was an assassin." A murmur rippled through the chamber. "Elaborate," the Chancellor ordered. The Revenant did not behave like a conventional warship. It did not engage in traditional fleet tactics. It struck from shadows. It disrupted our communications, misled our commanders, dismantled our formations, all before we even understood we were fighting. Zelvaran leaned forward, mandibles twitching. It was not designed for battle. It was designed for annihilation. Silence. The strategist folded her arms. "You suggest that the humans have abandoned conventional warfare?" "I suggest that the humans have evolved beyond it." The Chancellor's mandibles twitched. "And what do you propose we do?" Zelvaran hesitated. There was only one answer, but it was one that no Ulnari admiral had ever spoken aloud. "The Dominion is at a crossroads," he said carefully. "We can continue fighting the way we always have, and watch as the humans dismantle our fleets piece by piece. Or we adapt, we learn from them, we become what they fear, before they become what we cannot stop." The strategist scoffed. "You suggest that we imitate them? That we discard our fleets, our traditions, and fight as cowards in the dark?" Zelvaran's mandibles tightened. "I suggest that we survive." The chamber fell into a deep silence. It was a silence of contemplation and fear, because deep down, they all understood the truth. The Ulnari had always relied on brute strength, on sheer overwhelming power to crush their enemies. But against the Revenant, power had meant nothing. The Dominion was not losing a war, it was facing extinction. Beyond the chambers of the High Council, in the depths of the Dominion's intelligence networks, a quiet war was already underway. Analysts, tacticians, and scientists pored over every fragment of data from the battle. Every energy signature, every weapons discharge, every maneuver the Revenant had made. They needed answers. They needed weaknesses. They had to understand how a single ship had done what no fleet had ever accomplished before. And slowly, a terrifying realization began to form. The Revenant was not an anomaly. It was not some one-time experiment. The humans had been preparing for this war long before the Ulnari had even realized they were a threat. Zelvaran sat alone in his personal chamber aboard his flagship, staring at the star map before him. The Ulnari Dominion spanned over 1,000 systems. It had survived rebellions, wars, and rival empires. And yet, in one battle, one ship had proven that the entire Dominion was an empire of glass. His claws hovered over the command console. His mind raced. If the Revenant was only the beginning, if the humans had more like it, then this war was already lost. Unless his mandibles tightened. No. There was still a way. The Ulnari were not a species that accepted defeat. They were conquerors. And if the humans had rewritten the rules of war, then it was time for the Ulnari to break those rules entirely. Zelvaran took a slow breath, then entered a command sequence into his terminal. A secure, encrypted channel flickered to life. A voice answered on the other end. One that was not Ulnari. We need weapons, Zelvaran said, his voice like steel. Ones that can kill gods. The voice on the other end chuckled darkly. Weapons? No, Admiral. What you need is a new kind of war. Zelvaran had never felt fear before. Not true fear. As an Ulnari warlord, he had waged campaigns across countless star systems, crushed resistance with overwhelming force, and watched entire civilizations bend the knee before the Dominion. The Ulnari ruled through terror. They never felt it themselves. But now fear had become a whisper in the halls of power. Now it lurked in the shadows of the Dominion's mightiest warships. Now it carried a name, Revenant, and that was the true horror of it. It wasn't just that the Dominion had lost a battle. It was that they had never understood the war in the first place. Deep within the military intelligence headquarters of the Dominion, analysts worked without rest. Data had been pulled from every remaining warship in the fleet, every sensor recording, every weapons log, every intercepted transmission. The Revenant was a ghost in the data. It appeared, struck with surgical precision, and then vanished. No recorded hyperspace signature. No residual engine trails. No predictable attack patterns. This was not a warship. It was a Reaper. It fought like nothing the Dominion had ever faced. It never engaged head-on. It never presented itself as a target. It never fought a battle it couldn't win. Instead, it lured the Ulnari fleet into thinking they had control, and then ripped that control away in a single instant. One warship, one battle, and now, the entire Ulnari military doctrine was in question. The High Council was in turmoil. The Dominion's core systems had received news of the defeat, and despite the Council's best efforts, the truth had begun to spread. For the first time in millennia, the idea of Ulnari invincibility had been shattered. The ramifications were immediate. Several outer colonies began refusing orders from the Central Command, believing that the Dominion had grown weak. Ulnari warlords, once fiercely loyal, began considering their own survival above the Dominion itself. And worst of all, enemy factions, species that had long lived in fear of the Ulnari's wrath, began whispering of rebellion. Zelvaran had foreseen all of this. The Revenant's victory wasn't just about destroying a fleet. It was about planting a seed of uncertainty, a seed that had already begun to grow. The Dominion could not afford to wait. Zelvaran had spent decades at the pinnacle of Ulnari command, and he knew that hesitation was the greatest weakness of all. The Revenant was more than just an enemy. It was a sign of what was to come. And if the Dominion did not act now, it would be too late. The war was no longer about overwhelming force. It was no longer about who had the largest fleet or the most weapons. It was about who could adapt first. A new kind of Warxil-Varan's command ship left Ulnari space under the cover of darkness. No official mission logs. No transmissions sent to the High Council. No explanation given. Only a handful of his most trusted officers knew where they were going, because what they were about to do would change the course of history. For centuries, the Ulnari had refused to use certain technologies. They had dismissed them as dishonorable, unnatural, and dangerous. They relied on brute force. They relied on tradition. And that was why they had lost. But no more. Selvaran had spent weeks reviewing every battle report, every historical war the Ulnari had ever fought. He had searched for a pattern, and he had found it. The greatest Ulnari victories had not come from sheer strength. They had come from adaptation, from becoming what the enemy feared most. And now, the Dominion had a new enemy, and that meant they would need a new kind of weapon. The ship emerged from hyperspace in a dead system. No habitable planets, no active starports. Just a single dying sun casting long shadows across the void. But Zelvaran was not alone. As soon as his ship arrived, the sensors detected movement. Dozens of ships. No official transponder codes. No known configurations. These were not Ulnari vessels. They were something else. They had been watching, waiting, and now they were ready. The main communication channel activated, and a voice came through, cold, artificial, and inhuman. "You're late, Admiral." Selvaran did not flinch. "We are ready to discuss terms." Silence. Then the voice spoke again. "Are you now?" A new hologram flickered into existence before him. It showed a darkened world, its surface crawling with mechanical structures, towers stretching toward the sky, each one glowing with blue fire. "The Dominion has always feared us," the voice said. And for good reason. The image shifted. It showed ships, not like anything the Ulnari had ever built. They were sleek, silent, shadow black. They were predators. Zelvaran's mandibles tightened. He already knew what they were looking at. For centuries, the Dominion had refused to ally itself with synthetics. Artificial intelligence was outlawed. Cybernetic warfare was deemed too dangerous. But the humans had already crossed that line. Their warships were not just machines. They were self-thinking, self-learning predators, and that meant the Ulnari had no choice. If they wanted to survive, they would have to embrace the very thing they feared. "You want weapons," the voice said. "Weapons that can match the Revenant." Zelvaran met the machine's gaze. "No," he said. "We want something better. Another." Silence. "Then," the voice responded, "then you have come to the right place." The transmission cut. And just like that, the future of war had changed forever. The Dominion had made its choice. The war had entered a new phase, and as the Revenant prepared for its next hunt, it had no idea that the prey was about to become the predator. For centuries, the Ulnari Dominion had been unchallenged. Empires bowed before its might. Planets were subjugated under the thunder of its war fleets. The Dominion was the architect of order in the galaxy, ruling with fear, precision, and absolute control. But all it took was one ship, one single warship, to unravel it all. The Revenant, a ghost, a legend, a hunter in the void that had defied everything the Ulnari knew about war, and now? Now the Dominion was standing at the edge of the abyss. War had changed, and the question was, could the Ulnari change with it? The silent war begins. While the Dominion struggled to control its crumbling influence, whispers spread through the void. The Revenant's victory had not been contained. The news had slipped past Ulnari sensors and found its way into the far reaches of the galaxy. For the first time in recorded history, the Ulnari's enemies felt hope. Small rebellious factions began to rise. Planets that had long lived in fear of Ulnari warships suddenly questioned their loyalty. And then came something far more dangerous, something even the Revenant hadn't expected: the disappearance of entire Ulnari fleets. At first it was easy to dismiss. Space was vast. A few lost ships here and there meant nothing. A miscalculated jump, a pirate ambush, simple attrition. But then, the pattern emerged. Whole battle groups vanished. Not destroyed, not crippled, just gone. There were no distress signals, no wreckage, No survivors. It was as if the fleets had never existed. The Dominion was losing ships faster than it could replace them. And in the shadows, a war was brewing. Revenant's next hunt on the bridge of the Revenant. Captain Adrienne Vale stood in silence, staring at the tactical display before her. She had fought against the Dominion. She had watched them burn. But what she was seeing now? This wasn't the Ulnari's doing. The Dominion had been weakened, yes, but this was too precise, too methodical. Something else was hunting the Ulnari. And that meant only one thing. The balance of power was shifting. The Revenant's mission had never been about simple vengeance. It had been about sending a message, a warning to the galaxy that humanity was not to be trifled with, that Earth would not be subjugated. But now, there was a new predator in the void, something that even the Ulnari feared. The Dark Alliance far beyond the Dominion's borders, in a system unmarked on any known star charts. Zelvaron watched as the first of the new warships took shape. They were unlike anything the Ulnari had ever built. Sleek, deadly, designed for annihilation. The machine intelligence known as Voxus 7 had promised him power beyond imagination, and it had delivered. These were not warships, they were predators, capable of learning, adapting, and, most importantly, evolving. Zelvaron knew what had to be done. The Ulnari could no longer rely on fear and brute strength. They had to become what the humans had become. A true shadow in the void. And if that meant forging an alliance with the very machines they had long feared, so be it. The Dominion would not fall. It would be reborn. Final confrontation. The Revenant had been hunting the Dominion's forces for months, systematically dismantling their fleets, but then it received a signal, an encoded transmission, bouncing through thousands of relays across the galaxy, designed to be nearly untraceable. But it carried a simple message. You are not the only hunter anymore. And then, coordinates. Adrienne Vale exhaled, staring at the data. She had expected the Dominion to retaliate, expected them to rally their war machine for another grand assault. But this was something else. She had spent her entire life fighting wars the Ulnari didn't understand. But now, for the first time, she was the one in the dark. The Revenant jumped to the coordinates, and what it found changed everything. A battlefield without a battle. Ships, hundreds of them, drifting, lifeless, not destroyed, not crippled, just dead. No fires, no damage, no signs of combat, just emptiness. A fleet silenced before it ever had the chance to fight, and then, the sensors picked up something else, a shadow in the void. Not Ulnari, not human. Something new. The Revenant's computers struggled to identify it. No known classification, no transponder codes, just darkness. And then the comm systems crackled to life. Humanity thought it was alone in the dark. The voice was neither Ulnari nor human. It was something else entirely. But now, the void has awakened. And just like that, war had changed forever. Conclusion. The story of the Revenant was never just about one battle. It was about an awakening. A moment in time when the galaxy realized the old ways were over. The Ulnari Dominion had ruled through fear. But fear was no longer enough. Humanity had been the catalyst for change. But even they were not prepared for what came next. The war was no longer about nations. It was about survival. And in the end, the greatest truth of all was this. The void does not belong to anyone. It belongs to whoever is willing to claim it. And as the Revenant prepared for the next hunt, the question was no longer who would win. It was who would be left. If you enjoyed unraveling the mysteries of the universe, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us grow this community together. What do you think happened to the missing fleets? Could an unknown force be watching from the shadows? Let us know in the comments below. The hunt has only just begun.